In the middle of the Great Irish Famine, there was another rebellion, the Fourth Irish Rebellion mentioned in the 1916 proclamation, the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. But in Ireland, it's known by a different name. In popular mythology, it's known simply as the Battle of Widow McCormack's Cabbage Patch. And that mocking name, I think, gives a hint about just what kind of failure it was, because it was an absolute disaster, with none of the romance of Robert Emmet's rebellion, none of the success of the 1798 rebellion. It was a complete disaster. And the fact that the Irish rose up in 1848 shocked the British. At a time when they felt that they were aiding the starving Irish, they saw this as the worst kind of gratitude. Interestingly enough, though, the cause of the Young Ireland Rebellion was not the famine. Rather, it was inspired by a wave of revolutions that were going around, that was sweeping Europe at that time. It was known as the Year of Revolutions. It was seen as the springtime of all the peoples. And if you look at the present-day countries of France, Germany, Czech Republic, Austria, and so on, all of those countries had their monarchies taken from power. They all lost power in 1848. Now, they were to return very shortly afterwards. But there was a sense going around Europe that this was a time where the people could take the power, where they could assert their own rights and independence, and that you could get rid of aristocratic rule forever. The leaders in Ireland were young Irelanders called William Smith O'Brien and James Stephens. James Stephens would later become the mastermind behind the Fenians and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But the place that they targeted for the rebellion was in County Tipperary, on the border with County Kilkenny, because there had been a lot of violence there over the previous few years. They knew they had a lot of potential rebels. And William Smith O'Brien was able to gather 6,000 men who were all armed with pikes. Unfortunately, most of them were starving. And so when he took to the field on the 29th of July, he only had about 100, armed with pikes and rifles. And they erected barricades in this town of Ballingarry in County Tipperary. And the police then were alerted. They went off to arrest the ringleaders. But when they came to the town and found that these barricades had been erected, they panicked. They thought, this is a huge revolution. We're going to be under pressure. And so they retreated. And the Young Irelanders pursued them. And the police retreated all the way to a house owned by the widow McCormack. And they raced inside the house and took it over, taking hostage the widow McCormack's 5 young children. Now, the widow McCormack was not in the house, and when she arrived home, she was understandably upset. And she asked to go inside so she could look after her children, and they refused. So William Smith O'Brien, Stephens and the others, they surrounded the house. They occupied the wall and the perimeter, and there was a standoff. But William Smith O'Brien was a courageous man. So he walked out in the open and walked all the way up to the house so he could talk to these policemen. And he shook hands with them through the windows, and he said, "Boys, we're all Irish. There's no need for us to fight. Hand over your weapons and everything will be okay." But they refused, and he made his way back. And as he was making his way back, one constable decided to take a shot at him. And that was the kickstart for everything. The Young Irelanders opened fire. James Stephens rushed to rescue William Smith O'Brien and was wounded himself in the process. And there followed then a tense standoff with the men shooting at each other, but the police were perfectly protected within the house and the rebels were perfectly protected behind that perimeter wall. Only 2 people were killed in the entire incident. 2 men who were hiding behind the wall with the rebels and who moved to try and go to a safer location and then got shot by the police as they were moving. Eventually, the police heard what was going on and they decided to send reinforcements. And the Young Irelanders went up to intercept them, but they were running low of ammunition and they were repulsed. And then, realising that the whole thing was a complete failure, they just drifted away into the countryside. And that was the end of the 1848 rebellion. A rebellion that had resulted in the loss of no policemen, no soldiers, and only 2 people killed in total accidentally while they were trying to move to a more secure location. So the Battle of Widow McCormack's Cabbage Patch became something that they would laugh at, that they would mock. But behind it was something much more powerful and much more long-lasting. And that was the impact of the Young Ireland movement. And we've talked about them before in the context of Daniel O'Connell and his campaign for repeal, the role of Thomas Davis and this group. And what you really see here is the development of a new kind of Irish nationalism, one that believed that it needed its own mythology, its stories. It needed its literature, it needed its language. And Thomas Davis famously proclaimed that Ireland needed to have its own language, its own identity, and that this would be a better barrier to invasion than any mountain or any river. And it was somewhat of a ironical thing for him to say, because Davis himself didn't have a word of Irish. And yet he was able to kind of, I suppose, create this symbolism around a new Irish nationalism, a new Irish identity. And it was an identity that was in conflict with the more old-fashioned nationalism of Daniel O'Connell. He would famously say that he represented old Ireland, and so the name Young Ireland was applied pejoratively to this younger group. But I want to look in particular at the character of young Thomas Davis, because the most important thing about Davis, or one of the most important things, is that he actually developed these ideas while he was a student at Trinity. Because it was there, in the debating society, the College Historical Society, I'm wearing the tie again, it was in that debating society, the debating society where Wolfe Tone had developed as an orator, where Robert Emmet had excelled as an orator. It was there that Thomas Davis explored his ideas of Irishness. And as auditor, in other words, as the chairman of this debating society, he began delivering papers to the students about the kind of Ireland that was needed. He appears to have been a fairly plodding student. He wasn't particularly good, he wasn't particularly interested in the curriculum, but he seems to have been very highly strung, very emotional. And he delivered one famous address to the College Historical Society, which was about how you should look at literature and the world around you as a way of remedying the defects of a university education. And in it, he turned to the assembled students and he said, "Gentlemen, we have a country, we have a nation." And he carried forward much of this rhetoric to his work with his fellow Young Irelanders, Charles Gavin Duffy, who became the newspaper proprietor behind the Nation newspaper. And they, in a way, acted as a kind of a civil service for Daniel O'Connell. They prepared the minutes for his meetings. They organised the events. They organised the monster meetings. They had a newspaper, The Nation, which reached 250,000 people in 1843 and 1844. Davis wrote many of the articles himself. He wrote poetry. He wrote on economics. He wrote on history. He wrote on geography. And what they were doing was creating a sense of Irish cultural nationalism, different from the political nationalism that had been all too prevalent at the heart of Irish nationalism in the years before that. But there were tensions with O'Connell, because Davis had asserted in 1837 that if the government refused to give Ireland her rights, and if it kept Ireland down using force, then Ireland was entitled to use physical force to respond. Now, O'Connell believed that the winning of Irish independence wasn't worth the shedding of a single drop of blood, and the Young Irelanders had problems with that. That was that seemed to be closing off all future avenues. And so they began to rebel under his leadership. And they didn't really understand the point of the monster meetings and where they were going. They didn't like O'Connell's protestations of loyalty to the Queen Victoria, because O'Connell kind of believed that Victoria would help out the Irish and help support repeal. But they knew that this was just a fantasy. And following the arrest of the leaders in 1844 and their subsequent release, you see a split with O'Connell's movement. And the Young Irelanders then break from O'Connell. Davis died of scarlet fever, but the others then, they begin plotting, they begin discussing armed insurrection. And the writings of John Mitchell in particular incensed the British government. And they invented a new treason called treason felony, just specifically for Mitchell, so they could prosecute him. And so even before the outbreak of that rebellion in 1848, they had swooped to arrest Mitchell and Thomas Francis Meagher and other of the leaders. And many of those ended up spending the remainder of their days outside of Ireland. John Mitchell was sent to Van Diemen's Land. He escaped from there and made his way to the United States, where he became a close friend of Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, and in fact ended up in prison beside him during the American Civil War. 3 of his sons fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And Mitchell, who had always been a supporter of slavery, found a new home there. Thomas Francis Meagher also ended up in Australia and, like Mitchell, also escaped to the United States. But he ended up a key supporter of the Union side during the Civil War. He ended up becoming the commander of the Irish Brigade. But it seems by that point of his life, he was a terrible alcoholic and he was eventually relieved of his command. And he died, well, in mysterious circumstances. He fell off a riverboat after gambling. It's not known whether he was drunk and fell over. It's not known whether he was murdered, whether it was a dispute that had arisen at the gambling table. But that was the end of Thomas Francis Meagher. But Thomas Francis Meagher was responsible for leaving Ireland with one of her most important symbols before he was forced out in 1848. And that was her flag, the tricolour, the green, white and orange. Because he had brought that design back from France, inspired by the tricolour of France, the French revolutionaries, the red, white and blue. And I think the colours chosen for the Irish flag were crucially important, because the green represented Irish nationalism. The orange represented the other tradition, the Unionists, the Protestants, and the white represented eternal peace between them. And so the use of the Irish tricolour was to show that Irish nationalism could embrace all creeds, all backgrounds, all traditions and beliefs. It was, I suppose, a symbol of hope, so that even though the United Irish Rebellion was to end in horrible disaster, in ignominy, in an embarrassment, even despite all of that, the Young Irelanders left an enormous legacy. They inspired the leaders in the 20th century. Even during the treaty debates, Arthur Griffith, defending the treaty that had been signed with Britain, said, "I know that Thomas Davis would have supported this." And others then tried to bring to their aid other dead heroes from the Irish past. And what you see then as the 19th century developed through Douglas Hyde and his famous lecture at the end of the 19th century about de-Anglicising Ireland, the taking root of an Irish nationalism that was broad and wide-ranging, that believed that the Irish culture was important, that Irish nationality was something distinct from England, something different from Britain, that Ireland had her own nation, that Ireland was distinct, that Ireland was separate, and that because Ireland had a different culture, a different set of beliefs, therefore Ireland should have her own nation. And one of the great songs, one of the great ballads that Thomas Davis wrote was the ballad "A Nation Once Again." And you can Google it and watch it online, but it has the great lines about Ireland, once long a province, will be a nation once again. And it was that message, it was that legacy which was to endure in the decades ahead. So the Young Irelanders, although like many Irish rebels, they were failures, in terms of their long-lasting impact on Irish history, they set the agenda for the next 100 years.